Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome host CNN GPS, Fareed Zakaria.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be here. What we're going to do now is talk about the subject at hand, which is the American recovery and American jobs. And most of you are wondering, is it going to bounce back? Is the American economy going to finally bounce back the way it has in the past? And let me declare from the outset that I am an optimist. I tend to look at the glass half full. You know, I used to spar with George Will on the new This Week with George Stephanopoulos. And Will once said to me, he said, I don't know why you are an optimist, Fareed. It's much better to be a pessimist. Most of the time you're right. And when you're wrong, you're pleasantly surprised. But I'm an optimist. And I'll tell you why. Because you know, people look at the United States economy now. When I was thinking of coming to this country from India, I'm an immigrant from India, it was the late 70s, early 80s. You think things are bad now? You had the misery index, unemployment plus inflation. You had stagflation. You had the Soviet Union on the march. The United States was just 4 or 5 years after Vietnam and Watergate. If you think people don't trust public officials now and think all politicians are crooks, cast your mind back to those days after Watergate and Vietnam. So, terrible time. And then, by the middle of the 1980s, it was morning in America. The United States was on this big economic boom. And by 85, 86, we realized it was the Soviet Union that was crumbling. But we were it again. In 1987, the Dow Jones crashes, 22% in one day, and everyone says it's all over. The economy powered back. The recession of 92. You remember this? It was such a deep recession that a popular president, George H.W. Bush, who presides over victory in the Cold War, presides over victory in the Gulf War, has approval ratings at one point of 91%, loses to a then somewhat obscure governor of Arkansas. Am I allowed to say that? And in fact, so much anxiety in the air that it produces a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, who gets the highest percentage a third-party candidate has gotten since 1912, since Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft, and Theodore Roosevelt ran against each other. And yet, 2 years later, we were in the midst of the Clinton boom, in which economists were trying to figure out how could unemployment drop so far, so fast, without triggering inflation. You get the Asian crisis, and everyone says, my God, the world is going to come to an end. There were articles written called The Myth of Asia's Miracle. 2 years later, everything's booming again. That gets you to the Russian default of 98. Long-term capital management explodes. Robert Rubin says this is the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Growth comes back. March of 2000, the NASDAQ crashes. $3 trillion wiped off American stock exchanges. Growth comes back. And so the question is, will it come back this time? Well, let me tell you my one doubt before I bring the panel on. My one concern is this. If I had a PowerPoint, if I had a graph, I don't have a PowerPoint because somebody said to me once, people with PowerPoints rarely have power and they never have a point. But if I had a PowerPoint, what I would do is put up one chart. From 1945 to 1990, ever since World War II, US recoveries have followed this pattern. First, GDP comes back, then the jobs come back. So GDP recovers to pre-crisis levels, then the jobs come back. And that pattern from 1945 to 1990, that gap was 6 months. The GDP would come back, and then 6 months later, employment was back to pre-crisis levels. In 1990, something changed. After the recession of the 90s, the jobs came back not 6 months later, but 15 months later. After the recession of the early 2000s, the jobs came back not 15 months later, but 39 months later. And we are in the current slow recovery on track for the jobs to come back 65 months later, 5.5 years later. So something's happened in the last 20 years. And that something is two profound revolutions, a globalization revolution and a technology revolution. Globalization means that the whole world is now playing the same game, and you can make anything anywhere and send it around the world. The technology revolution means information technology has made it possible to massively rationalize your chains of operation and reduce the number of workers you need. Those two forces, globalization and technology, are acting like a pincer movement on the American worker. For American companies, by and large, this has been profoundly beneficial. They can surf this new world of technology and globalization, find places to find cheap capital, find places to find productive but also cheap labor, and find places where they can sell into that are growing at 5-6% a year. For the American worker, that is not possible. And so that person, he or she, is stuck in a very different world. And you see the fate of labor and capital diverging in a way that it has rarely done in the past. And that is the fundamental problem we face. And it will not be solved by saying we are the most innovative country in the world. We are. But let me give you one example. Apple is probably the most innovative company in America. Apple has a market cap that now dwarfs even Exxon. Apple makes about $100 billion a year in profits. In revenues. It employs about 49,000 people all over the world. The people who make Apple's products in Foxconn, which is mostly in China, a little bit in Taiwan, employ about 1 million people. So you can produce the most extraordinary products in the world. It is not clear that that means that the employment opportunities for the average American worker will improve. That is the dilemma we face. You look at the new Intel plants. They're 2 football fields long, cost $3 billion to make. They employ 200 people. And so that brings us to the question of how do you get jobs back in this economy? And there are a number of different ways one can do it. There is the rise of manufacturing, the return of manufacturing. That's powerful and profound, and as shale gas provides cheaper and cheaper energy, you are going to see more of that come back. But again, these tend to be jobs on the higher end. There are all kinds of areas we could encourage new economic activity. My personal favorite is tourism. I don't understand why we don't try to get more tourists to come to this country. The average Chinese tourist spends $4,000 when he's in the United States. Every tourist is a walking stimulus program, right? So why don't we just take all those Chinese tourists and say, why don't we get 3 times as many of them to come in? Every other country in the world has departments of tourism, ministries of tourism, encouraging people to come in, advertising the success of their country. What do? We have one department whose job it is to keep people out. That's all we're trying to do, is really keep them out, right? And that brings me to the final piece of this, the one area where it seems as though it would be a no-brainer to try to create employment opportunities in a way that is productive for the long-term economy of this country would be infrastructure. If you look at where interest rates are today, interest rates are about as low as they have ever been, and they're probably as low as they're ever going to be. If you cannot make productive investments with money this cheap right now, you shouldn't be running anything.